I want to start this morning by reading you a letter that I received this week. Dear Susan, how sad that a Christian church will seek to honour the memory of a man who espoused communism with violence, and when he obtained power, treated in utero children as Hitler treated Jews. I guess that's just another demonstration of the descent of Anglicanism into a tool of rabid left-wing political and social activists. Yours, Leo. I'm feeling the weight of responsibility as I stand here this morning after what we've been considering over the past 2 days, Friday night and Saturday morning, in relation to Mandela and the challenge he left us to consider how we are working to overcome racism, discrimination, prejudice and segregation in our own country. And that weight has intensified for me with the events in Paris yesterday, and all that is symbolised of fear and violence and discrimination in those acts of terror, not just in Paris, but of course around the world, that we're seeing at the present time. The writer of Mark's Gospel said to his disciples, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray." It behoves us to take stock from time to time and ask ourselves, are we being led astray? And to wonder if we would know if we were. Can we tell fanatical nationalism from appropriate national and cultural affirmation, pride even? Do we know how to find common threads and values amongst people who are different from us and celebrate our common humanity? Do we know how to do that? And so in a way, I'm inviting you to indulge me this morning as I preach to myself, because in the face of all that, we can very readily want to retreat into the places where we're safe and secure, where we know how things work, where we know how to benefit from the system as it is, where we know how to sit at table with others and eat food together and use knives and forks and things that we're familiar with. It's easy to retreat into those places. But that's not good enough. This weekend, we've been exploring the legacy of a world leader of our time, Nelson Mandela. He was here at St. Matthew's 20 years ago, and we've been considering his challenge to defeat the powers of racism, to overcome prejudice and social segregation, to build diverse and respectful nations. And we heard from speakers on Friday night just how far we still have to go to bring that to reality. This weekend we were led in our work by 2 Anglican clergy, Bob Scott, who worked for many years in anti-racism both here in Aotearoa, New Zealand and in Geneva, and in that World Council of Churches program to overcome racism. The other person was Andrew Byer, a priest of this diocese, of this parish, who on behalf of St. Matthew's, along with others, led a group called MOST, Mobilisation to Stop the Tour. And many hundreds of people mobilised week after week, Anglicans amongst them, in protest marches, education events, and various other activities against the South African apartheid regime, represented in what we call the racist tour, the Springbok Rugby Tour of New Zealand. The mobilization of people power was so successful from the perspective of those of us involved in that movement, as the test match in Hamilton, I think it was a test, was opposed, was stopped, and thereby drew international attention to the issue of apartheid, that system of government that discriminated, separated, and segregated at all levels and structures of society according to race. World pressure on the regime increased, and shortly after, that South African regime of apartheid came to an end. Through the unrelenting work of those many years ago and the people involved, our own George Armstrong, who's sitting here amongst us this morning, was one of those other people. The people of New Zealand were challenged sharply to face up to expressions of racism and discrimination in our own society. It was easier then, as it is now, to look overseas and to make loud tutting noises, dreadful, than it was to draw attention and look within our own communities and families and to insist on an acknowledgement of the changes we needed to make in our own nation. But the work of anti-racism, of bicultural development, and of the urgent need to overcome personal prejudice had begun, and none could escape it. The whole country was engaged in a conversation and held an opinion one way or another, supportive or resistant. And many families struggled with intensely held differences within families. In 1995, 20 years ago, Nelson Mandela came to this church. He thanked the people here from church and from wider community who were also present for their commitment to the struggle to overcome racism and to the consequences of intolerance. Today, more than 30 years since the ferment following the 1981 tour that focused the urgency for change here in New Zealand, more than 30 years since the cry to honour the Treaty of Waitangi, more than 30 years since the Reverend John Mullane, Vicar of St Matthew's here, urged the Anglican Church in its commitment to bicultural development that gathered momentum and led to the revision of our Anglican Constitution, the questions of racism, prejudice, social segregation, and racial stereotyping are back on the agenda of our super diverse city as they have not been for some time. The language is different, our communities are even more diverse, the issues are taking separate shape, but the impact of racism and prejudice are just as pernicious. Today, once more, there is an urgent need to open our hearts and minds and eyes to what's happening to people in our communities, as well as what's happening overseas. Once more, there is an urgent need to look closely and to notice the subtle expressions of racial stereotyping reported in our media, and to be aware of the not-so-subtle racism expressed in the negative statistics in health, education, employment, housing, and violence. Who are the leaders of today who will show us a way to a more compassionate expression of our common humanity before we too spiral into the ghettos of fear and exclusion that lead to violence? What we do know about leadership is that any time it leads us into fear, isolation, segregation, or hate, it's bad. It's leading us astray. It has to be challenged. Leadership worthy of our allegiance is leadership which encourages and enables us to overcome our fear of difference. It models and encourages respect. It includes and supports people and groups of people who struggle. The apocalyptic reading from the Gospel of Mark that we heard this morning is probably not according to scholars, part of the collection of authentic Jesus sayings, but that is not to discount it, as it certainly points to the overall purpose of Mark's gospel. This gospel has urgency about it. It's punchy gospel. It has lots of things urging us to get on with. There is no time to waste, we're told, in changing hearts and minds. There is no time to waste in choosing the way of Jesus that leads us towards a better and healthier world. The writer was addressing a community that seemed to believe the second coming was imminent. And this gospel records persuasively the ministry activity and teaching of Jesus, highlighting how and why we should be following the Jesus way, the way of Jesus, and choosing to live differently. Another wave of persecution had begun for them. Pax Romana was being enforced with increased violence and more crucifixions. And with it, violence towards those who did not conform or who dared to speak out against the prevailing norms and oppressive racist powers. Nation will rise against nation, the writer has Jesus say. Death and destruction are at hand. And so the writer urges through his gospel his hearers to take up the way of Jesus that leads us to a better life for all. This way includes standing against the powers of oppression and death, standing against structural injustice, standing against discrimination wherever you find it, and standing for a kinder, gentler way of respect and inclusion. The Jesus way requires openness to difference. It seeks compassion, love, and justice for those on the margins. It leads to life in harmony with neighbours and the earth, to ways that release the life-giving Spirit of God. And we seek those who will lead us into these kinder, gentler, more peaceable ways. Hannah's prayer, the reading from the First Testament that we heard, paints a word picture of how our world could be if God's vision were present amongst us. If that creation God envisioned was realized. The bows of the mighty are broken. The feeble gird on strength. Those who are full have hired themselves out for bread. But those who are hungry are fat with spoil. God will raise up the poor from the dust and lift the needy from the ash heap. We hear resonances of that prayer in Mary's song at Jesus' conception. And it is the resonances of the songs of those two women that seem to lie behind the vision that Jesus' way points us toward. It seems to me that once more churches like St. Matthew in the city need to hold a place for leaders who will encourage us on the way that leads us beyond our fear of change, beyond our limited experience of difference, beyond our concern for our own safety. It seems to me we need leaders that will lead us toward peaceful, just coexistence. And we can all be those leaders in our own places, be that our family, amongst our friends, in our workplaces, or in places where we do have the power of influence. It seems to me that we've rested long enough on the achievements of the past, that once more it's time to mobilize, to move further along the way toward the place where the feeble find strength, the hungry find bread, the needy sit in places of honor, and the fearful and anxious can be reassured. Right now, I can think of nothing better than to give Nelson Mandela the last word today, his day when we remember him. So as he says in the final paragraph of his book, Long Walk to Freedom, and I quote, "I have walked the long road to freedom. I have tried not to falter. I have made missteps along the way. But I have discovered the secret that after climbing a great hill, one finds there are many more hills to climb. I have taken a moment to rest here, to steal a view of the glorious vista that surrounds me, to look back on the distance I have come. But I can rest only for a moment, for with freedom come responsibilities, and I dare not linger, for my long road to freedom is not yet ended." God bless us as we take our next steps on that road.